Hi guys, welcome. This is our first ever Facebook Live through High Rock Online webinar. My name is Megan. I'm one of the pastors at High Rock, and I'm so glad if you are with us now, you are one of the first to be here. So thank you for tuning in. I am personally super excited to be here tonight with Dr. Aaron Griffith, who is a member of High Rock and also a professor at Sattler College. Aaron has done a ton of research into something that is on the top of our national consciousness right now around law and order, politics, and more particularly the way that Christians have been involved in participating or resisting this movement. This week, Aaron, has been pretty intense when we look at what's been happening around the indictment or lack of indictment for the police that were involved in shooting Breonna Taylor, the state of reaction that exists within Christians and non-Christians all over the country and the world. And this is not a new story, right? This is one that's been continuing, and we have an election coming up in November. And so I've heard from a lot of people who aren't sure what to do in this moment as a Christian. Like, what does it look like to interact with this, knowing that there seems to be a lot at stake? And so I'm excited that you were willing to help step into this with us today and just help suss some of this out. I own and recognize the fact that we are two white people talking about the intersection of police brutality and racism and law and order, whatever that means. And that in this moment, one of the things that I've been trying to practice is centering non-white voices. And so I just own some of what we are lacking as we present today. I just put that out there to you viewers and participants in this, that our response to this, it comes from a posture of wanting to be faithfully responding to what God has invited us into. At High Rock, we are bound together as being people who are curious about our faith, recognizing that there aren't really hard and fast, easy answers to a lot of it. And so we're just trying to be faithful here. I bet that we might make mistakes in some of this, but I saw something on Facebook earlier today that someone had seen in their kids' first grade classroom that mistakes are expected. But one of the things that we believe that in Christ, there is grace and forgiveness. And so, friends, I am glad that you are here with us today. Aaron, we're so grateful to have you, and just excited to dig into Q&A later. So tune in as you have questions throughout this presentation. Feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will respond to them after the end of this presentation. That's about 30 minutes. And there is no question that goes too far here. We are going to ask that everyone just abide by charity. We like this idea of approaching everyone with curiosity and compassion, because it's what we see Jesus having done with people, and we're trying to model that same thing as people that follow Christ. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to get going. God, I thank you for the ways that you knit us together and invite us to your work in the world, that we get to be your co-laborers in creation and in reconciliation. And so I pray for this conversation tonight, that it might be one that pleases you and works towards justice and healing as you see it. Amen. All right, Aaron, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pastor Megan. It's great to be with you this evening, and I am excited to speak with you about law and order and the Christian church in the United States. I'm a historian. I research, write, and teach on issues of religion, politics, and criminal justice. And what I want to do this evening is give you a brief introduction to the history of law and order politics in the modern United States, with an eye toward the influence and responses of Christians. I hope this talk can give us some tools for thinking through the regular mobilization of law and order rhetoric in our current political moment. To give you a couple of recent examples, we are in an election season right now where law and order has become a common phrase used by our president, Donald Trump, and other leaders, typically with reference to cracking down on protests. In the mid-1990s, there were few politicians more committed to law and order than Joe Biden, then a senator from Delaware, and now the Democratic candidate opposing Donald Trump. Law and order was a slogan mobilized throughout the 20th century by Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, and liberals, all of whom saw it as a mainstream issue of concern and a phrase with profound political power. So before we get into this history, you may be thinking, what do we even mean by law and order? So let's begin by discussing a different term, one that I think is easily confused with law and order, and that is the rule of law. Rule of law simply refers to the law being well defined and enforced equally and enforced consistently by the authorities. So there's a clear law against theft. And if somebody commits theft, it doesn't matter who that person is. The state has to address that violation. The rule of law also means that a government has to address violations in a standardized way. There can't be wildly different responses to violations of the law. There has to be equality. There has to be fairness. By contrast, law and order is a phrase in the history of modern American politics that's typically mobilized to refer to the need to crack down on what is perceived as social disorder or rising crime. If rule of law generally refers to equality and fairness, law and order is punitive. It's aggressive. It connotes the need to tamp down or crack down, to punish those seen as disorderly, and to prevent disorder with the threat of a strong law enforcement response. Okay, so this is the general framework I want us to keep in mind. But as we will see, often the line between these two terms is complicated and contested. We'll return to that point in a moment. Here's a general sense of the stakes, though. As this chart from the Prison Policy Initiative shows, the United States locks up more people per capita than any nation in the world, with 2.3 million people confined nationwide. This population grew rapidly over the past 40 years, from the 1970s on, a 500% increase, according to the Sentencing Project. When people talk about mass incarceration, this is what they mean. Massive numbers of people behind bars and tremendous growth in a relatively short amount of time in our nation's history as a result of changes in law, sentencing practices, and policing and prosecution strategies. The number of Black Americans behind bars is even more dramatic. So for example, Black men today are imprisoned at a rate 6.5 times higher than white men, and since the late 60s are more likely to have been imprisoned than to have graduated from college with a 4-year degree. So when I talk about law and order in the United States, these are the stakes that I have in mind. I want to make two big points and then walk through a quick historical tour with you. The first point is that law and order in America has religious, particularly Christian, connections and relevance. Whether supporting law and order politics or opposing them, Christians have seen the issue as a major concern. Second, race has been key in framing Americans, especially American Christians, engagement with law and order. But understanding the role of race is tricky, particularly in a post-civil rights movement context. To understand how race matters, we have to pay attention to what the author and legal scholar Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow, with the emphasis on new as opposed to old. Modern criminal justice purports to operate in a colorblind, race-neutral manner, even as it disproportionately affects people of color. So with those two big points in mind, let's begin a historical survey, and let's begin in the early 20th century. So around the early 20th century, there was the beginning of an expanded national vision of policy and public opinion on the need for crime fighting. Crime rates had risen as more people migrated into crowded urban neighborhoods and struggled with economic dislocation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Politicians began to deliver public appeals on the need for more law enforcement and for law and order. And presidents launched several federal policy broadsides against crime that bolstered and modernized policing efforts. And here on this slide, you can see a 1929 photo of the new fingerprinting division at the precursor organization to the FBI, which was pretty much brand new at the time, and a photo of an officer in the newly professionalized New York Police Department. These are emblems of law enforcement's modernization and expansion in the early 20th century. Political leaders trumpeted the need for religious support of this new crime war. So Franklin Roosevelt's Attorney General, Homer Cummings, said the role of religion in crime prevention was obvious. And Roosevelt himself articulated his vision for what he called quick and certain justice in meetings with Christian groups. Religious leaders responded in turn, actively shaping a new anti-crime consciousness and urging Christian support for law enforcement. And here you can see a variety of newspaper and magazine clippings detailing the religious dimensions of early 20th century law and order. From an article talking about how there's Christians among the New York police, who the famous Christian author Charles Sheldon actually called missionaries, to an announcement for a Law and Order Sunday. American law and order in the early 20th century was not only a religious cause, though. It was also embedded in a racial imagination. Black Americans were no longer enslaved, but their skin color marked them as criminals in the eyes of many white Americans. Black Americans were viewed as more likely to commit crimes because of their race, and seen by many white Americans as more likely to ignore crime in their own neighborhoods. And in the South, especially, Black men were viewed as a predatory threat to white women. Of course, none of this was actually true, but these ideas had cultural and political power. This idea that Black Americans were inherently criminal helped underwrite punitive responses by both law enforcement and lynch mobs. And there was, as the historian Khalil Muhammad has written, a widespread condemnation of Blackness, one that helped underwrite the criminalization and arrest of Black people. One famous example of this was the case of the Scottsboro Boys, pictured here, who were falsely accused of the rape of a white woman, imprisoned in Alabama in the 1930s, and freed after several years only because of tremendous national outcry. White Christian leaders contributed to this narrative as well, and I'm going to show you one major example here. In 1904, a Baptist minister named John Roach Stratton wrote an article in a major national magazine that pointed to the increasing numbers of lynchings and mob killings of African Americans as proof not of rampant white supremacist violence, but of rising Black criminality. And Stratton contended that Black crime rates, which he saw as disproportionately high, were evidence that Black Americans were not ready to accept the burdens of freedom following their enslavement. And he said in this article, "We take these savages from their simple life and their low plane of evolution and attempt to give them an enlightenment for which the stronger races have prepared themselves through ages of growth. Like little children in a tropical garden, they eat all fruit merely because it looks pretty or tastes sweet." Stratton's racist argument here was that Black people were not suited to modern American society, and that there was some sort of inherent flaw that kept them from obeying the law. The implication then was that Black criminality justified the increased policing of Black people. And Stratton would become a well-known evangelical Christian pastor and would continue to draw on these racialized sentiments in his public ministry during the 1920s as he regularly pushed for more law and order. So this racist assumption that Black Americans were somehow prone to criminality underlay a good deal of law and order rhetoric and worries about rising crime. And it put Black Christians in a bind. So many Black Christian leaders were also worried about crime during the early 20th century, and some spoke of their own desire for expanded law enforcement. These leaders were often focused on the crime of lynching and white supremacist violence against Black people. What these Black Americans wanted was assurance of the rule of law, a guarantee that they would be protected from the crimes committed and regularly overlooked by a white supremacist social order. And they wanted the assurance that they would receive fair treatment by police and in courts of law. But by talking up crime as a social problem, Black Christian leaders risked playing into the racist assumptions about Black criminality operative among many of their white brethren, like John Roach Stratton. Also, many Black Christian leaders were not only interested in expanding the role of law enforcement, they also wanted to help secure more just policies that would benefit their communities economically, help them to attain more equality in housing, schools, and public life more generally. And this broader vision of uplift was often ignored in favor of an approach that prioritized law and order alone. So let's now move to the 1960s. In the 1960s, around this time, there were a series of major national civil rights victories for African Americans. The desegregation of public schools and facilities, the guarantee of equal voting rights, and protection from discrimination in housing. However, racism persisted. Black Americans still faced much tougher economic burdens than whites, and the association of Blackness with criminality continued. Even though they were increasingly assured of protection under new civil rights policies, Black Americans still faced the threat of over-policing of their communities and the threat of police brutality. The combination of all these burdens pushed some communities to the edge, and uprisings erupted in American cities throughout the late 60s. One famous uprising was in 1965 in the predominantly Black Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts. There, residents had long complained of the LAPD's harsh tactics, and accusations of police brutality in the neighborhood were common. Everything spilled over in the midst of a confrontation between police and a man that police had stopped for erratic driving. A crowd gathered around the confrontation and a scuffle began, and residents, fed up with mistreatment and lack of attention by their leaders, began to destroy property. More than 35,000 residents eventually joined the fray. Los Angeles police and the National Guard mobilized to quell the violence, and the aftermath of this uprising was the destruction of entire city blocks, 3,000 arrests, and 34 dead. There were two broad responses to this uprising in Watts that we can see from Christian leaders. So one can be seen in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., pictured here. When King explained the uprising, he pointed to the unjust conditions that prompted it and the nation's collective responsibility for what was going on. Though he did not defend the destruction of property, King argued that the unrest was due to, in his words, the economic deprivation, racial isolation, inadequate housing, and general despair of thousands of Black people. King also pointed to the role of police brutality in Watts, noting its history in the neighborhood, as well as the fact that almost all of the lives lost in the uprising itself were a result of police killings. For King, a riot was not evidence of the lack of personal responsibility. No, he said, a riot is the language of the unheard. And King knew that uprisings like Watts would prompt calls for more law and order. But instead of pushing for tougher laws and more policing, King argued for expanded anti-poverty programs. By contrast, Billy Graham, also pictured here, America's most famous evangelical Christian leader and one of the most popular people in the nation at the time, had a different message. In the midst of the Watts uprising, Graham preached that we need salvation from lawlessness, and he asked Congress to pass tough new laws against lawbreaking. Tough new criminal procedure rules. He wanted them to crack down on crime, street crime in particular, and other white evangelical leaders joined with Graham to not only decry the events in Watts, but to connect them to what they saw as the misguided goals of the civil rights movement more broadly. The president of one Christian college who had previously praised segregation only a few years earlier, he linked the rioting in Watts to peaceful civil rights protests, and he dismissed claims of police brutality as utter nonsense. And for white evangelicals, the answer to the unrest in America's cities was not expanded anti-poverty efforts, as King had argued, or a reckoning with racist policing practices. Instead, it was more law and order. And white evangelicals got their wish. The immediate and long-term governmental response to situations like Watts stressed militarized security. 16,000 federal troops were marshaled to the neighborhood, arriving in helicopters and tanks, and after the smoke cleared in Watts and other areas affected by uprisings across the country, a strong law enforcement presence remained. The Watts response foreshadowed the aggressive mode of policing that would characterize American crime fighting and urban policy for decades to come. Politicians saw an opportunity in crisis moments like Watts and began to make law and order a big part of their electoral appeals and policy. And it's important to note that this was a bipartisan move. As historians like Elizabeth Hinton have shown, President Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, called for a war on crime and began advocating for federal investment in local police as a means for preventing future uprisings. Republican Ronald Reagan won the California governor's race in 1966, and Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968 by embracing law and order as part of their campaigns. Part of Republican success depended on their courting of white evangelical Christians. For example, Billy Graham became a prominent booster of Nixon and helped the candidate execute his Southern strategy, by which he flipped the formerly Democratic South to the Republican Party. Graham would in turn pray at Nixon's inauguration, and he asked God in that prayer to deliver America from the whirlwind of crime, division, and rebellion. Many law and order politicians, like Nixon, knew that this appeal was racially coded. And they knew that they could gain support from whites who were frustrated with protests on behalf of Black Americans. Law and order increasingly became a way for many politicians to appeal to frustrated, frightened white voters by linking urban unrest, civil rights, and the specter of street crime all together. With some exceptions, politicians were less likely to make overt segregationist or overt racist appeals from the 60s on. Instead, they found that they could call for more law and order as a catch-all phrase that allowed white voters to connect the dots. Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, writes in his diary in 1969 that Nixon had said to him, quote, "You have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks, And the key is to devise a system that recognizes this while appearing not to. That was Nixon's quote to Haldeman. And Nixon and many other politicians, they saw that this system could be law and order politicking, an anti-crime policy that focused police resources on Black neighborhoods. Now, to be sure, not all voters or politicians who were interested in law and order issues saw things the same way that Nixon did. Indeed, crime was rising in the 1960s, and many Americans, white and Black, felt unsafe and were frustrated by violent crime in their communities. But the law and order perspective articulated here by Nixon and others and relied on this assumption that crime was somehow inextricably linked to Blackness. And this continued to allow many Americans to believe that the best way to solve the crime problem was not by addressing root causes for why people commit crimes or figuring out why crime might be rising in certain neighborhoods in any systemic way. Instead, the answer was getting tough. And this meant also dismissing complaints from African Americans and others who bore the brunt of law and order policies and faced increasingly harsh and expansive policing and prosecution tactics. So Black Christians, though, contested law and order rhetoric and policies. The civil rights leader, Mississippi civil rights leader, Fannie Lou Hamer, a devout Baptist, summed up well, I think, Black Christian criticisms and concerns about law and order politics' racial character. She said, "Black people know what white people mean when they say law and order. America is substituting cries of law and order for plain respect for Blacks as Blacks." Tom Skinner, also pictured here, a Black evangelist known popularly as Harlem's Billy Graham, had harsh words for his white namesake over the law and order issue. At a 1970 intervarsity student gathering, Skinner blasted the white evangelicals like Billy Graham, who had, in his words, joined the hoot and cry for law and order. What they actually mean by law and order, Skinner declared, is all the order for us and all the law for them. The police in the Black community, Skinner said, have become nothing more than an occupational force for the purpose of maintaining the interests of white society. Instead of focusing on corrupt politicians or slumlords who ravage Black neighborhoods, Skinner argued, evangelicals support the policies that lock up poor Black teenagers. And Skinner had a hard word for the Christians who wanted to just focus on preaching the gospel, simply on preaching the gospel, who thought that getting involved in these issues would make them too political or that law and order concerns were too controversial. For these Christians, those who saw moderation or a spiritual focus as the priority, Skinner's message was that there is no possible way you can talk about preaching the gospel, he said, if you do not want to deal with the issues that bind people. However, critical arguments like those of Hamer and Skinner did not carry the day for most Americans, or most white Christians. Law and order remained a powerful force in politics, accepted by many Americans, and politicians of all stripes continued to push it as a solution to problems of unrest and crime. Part of the reason law and order's power persisted was that it increasingly became possible to view it in a colorblind, race-neutral manner, and as something that all citizens, including Black Americans, desired. After all, no one wants crime in their neighborhoods. No one wants to feel unsafe. But law and order politics helped ramp up the reach of law enforcement, as invasive policing tactics like stop and frisk became more common, and the war on drugs expanded across the nation in the 1980s and 90s. At every stage, leaders pointed to how these law enforcement strategies were colorblind and even designed to help communities of color. Law enforcement gained even a more humanitarian face through practices like community policing, a reformist approach that purported to train and deploy police to have better relationships with the people in the neighborhoods they served. The problem, though, was that community policing embedded police all the more deeply within neighborhoods. And in the minds of many residents in these heavily policed neighborhoods, primarily served as a PR move for police departments. Community policing was also built on the assumption that the fundamental problems facing neighborhoods were problems that policing could address instead of investments in economic development, education, mental health, or other social services. And you can see here one example of a rendering of this approach. This is a 1968 booklet produced by the California Governor's Office, so Ronald Reagan's office. And in this booklet are stories of rising crime and urban disorder with images of kindly policemen who are embedded within neighborhoods and befriending children. Importantly, alongside an image of a white family at prayer, showcasing the religious dimensions of this narrative as well. The hope was that police could be seen as friends and as community resources. And this was a well-intentioned hope from many quarters, but from the advent of these initiatives in the 70s onward, little actually changed in terms of law enforcement practice. Instances of police brutality remained common, and more Americans found themselves behind bars. So, colorblind justice and reforms like community policing fundamentally did not reckon with the profound racial and economic disparities already embedded within the justice system, or the fact that law enforcement was growing in size and budgets, while other forms of state responses to inequality, like jobs programs and public education, were increasingly faced with budget cuts, especially from the 80s onward. Few politicians were willing to ask why crimes might be committed in the first place, and what the best long-term strategy for dealing with crime might be, beyond simple law and order punitive responses that stressed arrest and punishment. So this brings us to our present moment. Law and order not only remains a regular refrain from some politicians, but law and order politics retains its religious Christian currency. And perhaps no moment better showcases this than one from earlier this year. George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man, died in the midst of an arrest as a police officer pinned him to the ground with his knee on his neck, despite Floyd's pleas that he couldn't breathe. Protests erupted once video of the arrest came out. These were protests not only of Floyd's death, but of the ways his death was the culmination of decades of harmful policing tactics and strategies that were often popular, but that resulted in millions of Americans, especially Black Americans, being locked up and surveilled and brutalized. The answer, many protesters claimed, was to defund the police, reduce our society's reliance on policing and law and order as the solutions to our problems, and to hold police and elected officials accountable when unjust actions occur. Some Christians joined and defended protests, pointing out the justice of their cause and the need for the nation to reckon with its sins, racism, and overcriminalization. President Trump, seeking to make an appeal to his Christian supporters, had a different message. In the midst of protests, Trump went to St. John's Church near the White House and posed for photos with a Bible in his hand. Just before the photo op, law enforcement brutally cleared peaceful protesters and the press who were camped in nearby Lafayette Park, utilizing tear gas, batons, and violent force with little to no warning. Trump defended the photo op and the dispersal of protesters. Most religious leaders loved it, he said. Right now, I think the nation needs law and order, he said. We need healing and all of those things, but we need safety in our cities. For the Bible-wielding President Trump, Christianity and law and order politics were linked. So, how should Christians think about this history and the conflict evident here in our present moment? I can't pretend to offer an entirely comprehensive theological account here, but I want to share with you some quick thoughts before we move to Q&A. First, here is a word for those who find themselves enchanted by the direct linkage of law and order and Christianity, as seen in something like Trump's Bible photo op. I hope the problems of this linkage are evident based on the history I've offered here, a history of racism embedded within our society and our justice system, and a history of the ways that Christians have let fear of crime and disorder push us into harmful, punitive responses. But I also hope the problems are evident through consideration of the witness of the life and death of Jesus. Jesus was put to death by the authorities and executed on an instrument of state violence. Jesus identified with those who were victimized by those in power. And indeed, his followers regularly found themselves outside the law in their work on behalf of Jesus' revolutionary new kingdom. Jesus had brought freedom to the captives. But second, I hope that this history has given us a quick sense of how we cannot be neutral on these issues. Some of us may feel uncomfortable with law and order appeals, and we may feel like punitive rhetoric is in bad taste. But even if we are uncomfortable with aggressive law and order politicking, we can easily be tempted to see these matters as secondary, as issues that should be deprioritized in favor of more spiritual or more churchy kinds of things. And if that's you, I would encourage us to listen to the voice of Tom Skinner, who I mentioned earlier, who protested not only white Christians' support of law and order, but also Christians' unwillingness to advocate directly for those who have borne the brunt of punitive politics. Skinner said that there is no possible way you can talk about preaching the gospel if you do not want to deal with the issues that bind people. And I happen to think that Skinner was right. The issues that bind people are indeed gospel issues. Those in our nation who constantly face surveillance and arrest and the possibility of violence by police or even by private citizens, these are all people made in the image of God. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, and so many, many, many more. To not say their names or to not take their concerns seriously, to not take their deaths seriously, demonstrates not only a failure to reckon with this long history of how racism and religion and law and order have worked in tandem in our nation. In my view, it also risks denying Jesus' command to love our neighbors in his proclamation of freedom to the captives. Thank you.
Aaron, thank you. We have a couple of questions. Friends, you should feel free to drop any other questions in the chat there. And he's very happy and wants to engage with us. I know that was a lot of information. Yeah, I have questions of my own. So if you guys don't get in there, I'm just going to bore you with my questions. So Tiffany asks, where the hell is the rule of law right now?
Where is the rule of law right now?
Mm-hmm.
I think we're in an interesting place because there has been a reckoning in broader American society, even among those who formerly would have called themselves tough on crime, law and order politicians or leaders, that where we're at is not sustainable, that it's not fiscally sustainable, it's not just even, and there have been calls for reform, and there's been some progress made, especially on the federal level and on state levels as well. The First Step Act was a giant piece of federal legislation passed under the Trump administration. That was one of the larger federal overhauls, pieces of criminal justice reform on the federal level to pass in a long time. So I think we're in a moment where there is some incremental progress, but two things. One is that this is incremental at best. There are so many policy options on the table, and it seems to me like the ones that most politicians, most citizens even, see as viable are very slight, very meager, that do not reckon fundamentally with the deep systemic issues in play. But secondly, and more concerning, is just the fact that we have moved away even from that, it seems like, in the last few months, with the deployment of overt law and order rhetoric, the deployment of time and time again, the language like thugs and looters and if you loot, we shoot and stuff like that, to talk about responses to issues of police brutality and criminal injustice. And I worry that even the most meager of reforms are at risk right now because of this, that there is a new law and order moment that is just overtaking everything. And that concerns me. On the other hand, there is amazing work that's being done, especially by grassroots activists on the local level and on the state level even, all across the nation, in places, that are, I think people are starting to realize that we need to make a change. And I'm encouraged by that. And I hope it's something that won't just be limited to the local level, but can be a national cause as well. So.
Yeah. Mark was wondering about the tie-in of eugenics to early 20th century Christian racial thought.
Yeah, that's definitely there. And this is where I think one of the things historians have started to reckon with over the last few years, and just observers of criminal justice more generally, is how the development of modern American criminal justice, modern American law and order, is not just simply a story of backlash. It's not just simply a story of, conservatives overtaking liberals or something like that. Like liberal sentiments, liberal eugenics history is implicated in it as well. And John Roach Stratton, the guy I talked about, at the same time, I mean, he branded himself very much as a fundamentalist, conservative. But the kinds of things he's saying are being said by leading social scientific criminologists and thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th century about how, in their words, that Black people are more just naturally more prone to criminality, that they are as a result of their biology or their environment, and it's there, and it's something that I think criminologists have had to reckon with, and liberal social scientists have had to reckon with as well, is the way that eugenics style rhetoric is there and caused huge problems. And in some ways, I think, as I mentioned, Khalil Muhammad's work is still with us. And so that's a great observation.
To Tiffany again is wondering, how does Law and Order play on the idea of an individual solution to a systemic problem? I.e., if we lock up one person, one bad person, it will solve the issue. And I actually want to throw another thing on there. How do you understand the intersection of evangelicalism in with that that idea of like the individual solution to a systemic problem?
Yeah. So, side note, this is where I pitch my book. In my book, God's Law and Order, I talk about this, how evangelical Christians, famously individualists throughout much of the 20th century, I actually argue in my book that this helps them in some ways. It hurts them in the ways you might expect. Like, it hurts them in the ways in analysis of systemic racism and understanding the systemic nature of issues related to poverty and injustice more generally. It's certainly something I think that even today evangelicals are trying to still figure out. And this is why even something in the last couple of weeks we've heard a lot of evangelicals and a lot of conservatives criticize critical race theory as a mode of analysis that removes individual responsibility. So we still see that. And I think that's something we should be aware of in making it possible for someone like Billy Graham to say what he said in the midst of Watts, and for Christians today to side with law and order politicians. However, I think that evangelicals have in their focus on individual souls and the one soul at a time, to use Billy Graham's phrase. I think there's some resources there that we can draw on, where we can invest in relationships, where we can make friendships, particularly with those who are been victimized or harmed by our systems of punishment. We can really lean into those direct connections, and hopefully they will create transformation. So I write in my book about a guy who was converted at a Billy Graham crusade in 1949. And he was himself a former gangster, and he has this dramatic conversion experience where he leaves his life of crime. And after a couple of years, he decides that he needs to go and work with youth in New York City. And he spends the next several years in a very traditional evangelical, evangelistic ministry model, doing that work with gangs and youth in New York City. And it's not perfect. He had challenges. However, I think he saw, in the book I write about how he saw how through his very individualistic ministry mode and anthropology, he made friendships and had connections that helped him understand what people were going through. Mm-hmm. And that helped him realize the problems in criminal justice, and mm-hmm. that prison is not the answer for mm-hmm. these kids. And that moment really has stuck with me, and I would hope that evangelicals can leverage the best of their individualism in our current moment even. To add to that, though, I think one of the things I didn't mention in my history here, but that's important, is the way that, especially from the 70s on, activists and reformers began developing restorative justice as an option for dealing with issues of crime, of offenses, very real offenses that might happen. And restorative justice is a model that prioritizes relationships and obligations, meaning it's not individualistic. It's not just about one person doing a crime in some abstract sense. It's a crime against a community, a crime against another person and the network of obligations that arise from that offense, and an orientation towards what those broken relationships and broken community networks, what they need. And that's what response to crime should look like. And I think that there's something there that is worth considering. And the challenge is that it's hard to do, and it's hard to do without lapsing into punitive solutions or using that somehow as a threat. It requires really a communal vision of what justice can look like.
And I'm going to give a quick shout out to my my alma mater. North Park Theological Seminary has launched, under the leadership of Dr. Michelle Clifton Soderstrom, an amazing restorative justice program in one of the local maximum security prisons there. And to just see what I think one of the best things of evangelicalism is, like what you said, that it focuses on the relationship between a person and God. But at its core, previously, that other bar of the cross, as Lisa Sharon Harper likes to talk about, the horizontal bar of the cross that talks about your relationship to your community, that has been underemphasized. So I was seeing the work that has come out of that relationship. Like, I was personally very impacted by that, but it's also shifted the trajectory of how I understand not just my relationship to God, but my relationship to my community. And so, like, yes, second that, and love, I don't know, restoration feels like God's heart anyway. So where we can partner in that feels like such a good invitation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's, advocates of restorative justice, people like Howard Zehr, will say things like, restorative is not a solution to mass incarceration. Meaning, if we're implementing this, I think at least what he means is that if we're implementing this as a restorative approach, as a way just to solve our prison problem, then we've already messed up. Like, we've already turned this into something that is easy, that has quantifiable metrics and is going to be driven by in some way that isn't human focused. And I think for a lot of restorative justice advocates, there's the risk of saying that this can be the solution, because the focus should just be on the people and should be on the communities, and let them determine what needs to happen. But I'm very optimistic about restorative solutions as a way to not only address issues related to imprisonment and punitive politics, but simply actually as a way to address the needs of victims. Because that's the crazy thing about much of our current system, is that victims of crime often are left out of any equation in terms of acknowledgement, recompense, restoration, and I think that's a huge issue, and that's something we need to take seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Cliff, I see that you asked a question about restorative justice. Can you just drop a thumbs up in the chat if that helped answer all of your thoughts? I feel like we covered a lot. I want to make sure that we can come back to it if we need to. In that idea of recompense, Sherry is asking, what's your position on reparations? Not a loaded question or anything.
I think I am very much pro reparations. I mean, I think Ta-Nehisi Coates' Atlantic article from a few years back was sort of revolutionary in my own mind of thinking that through. And I think institutions, especially institutions that have directly benefited from the exploited labor of Black people, both before emancipation and after, but considering things like convict leasing and the ways that even our society throughout the 20th century has relied on exploited labor, especially from prisoners. I think there has to be a deep accounting of not only where blame lies, but what our restorative obligations are. And that's not an easy conversation, right? But to do restorative justice is hopefully not just something an individual does because of that single violation. Hopefully it's something that as a society we can look towards, something we all do. So, yeah.
And if you are looking for more like theological framing of that to our viewers, Pastor Dave Swaim had a sermon on that couple of months ago at this point, that was super helpful. Maybe one of my colleagues who's on right now can find it and drop it in the chat. But if you're looking for a theological framework for that, it could be really helpful for you. Let's see. Robert asked, Tom Skinner preached this message to white evangelicals years ago. Why do you think it's so hard for them to get this truth? And I'm going to say, why is it so hard for us? Because we are white evangelicals.
Yeah. So when Skinner preached that message, and it was not the only time he was saying these kinds of things, white evangelicals immediately distanced themselves from him and his ministry. This wasn't just a single moment, but it happened over the course of a couple of years. And before that, he is all over evangelical magazines. He has I think he's like a radio show. He's very much he has books that evangelical publishing houses are putting out about him and by him. And in the late 60s, early 70s, he makes this turn because he started to realize the limitations of not Christianity, but of this evangelical tradition. And I think there's a line that sticks out to me that I write about this a little bit in the book, where the head of a major evangelical organization, a white evangelical, says we're not going to work with Skinner anymore because we feel like he's a bit too pepped up on race issues. And I think that's it. It was just so obvious. Like, he was talking about race. He was talking about not just criminal justice, but a whole host of ways that racism was still endemic after the civil rights movement within not only American society, but within churches. And that was very uncomfortable. That does not sell advertising on Christian radio. That does not make for an enjoyable, sermon that is going to make everybody feel good. And evangelicalism had created this culture that wanted comfort, that wanted to feel good about itself and its status. And I think bringing up race was exactly the problem. Today, I think there's many people like Skinner that are saying very similar things. And, there is both within and outside evangelicalism. I think the distinction I made at the end of my talk is one that I think is crucial to recognize. There are people who will remain committed to law and order, who will remain committed to punitive policies and rhetoric, and have no problem with race baiting and all the things that we see coming out often in our political in the moment we're in. But then there's a lot of people who just say, like, that's not me. I don't support it. I don't like it. But there's other things that are at stake in this election or in the world. This is not a major issue. I'm personally not a racist, so And I think Skinner's moment, in the same way, it's an echo of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, where King is not writing to like overt white supremacists. He's writing to white moderates. He's saying your moderation, your unwillingness to talk about this stuff, to get involved, make mistakes, your unwillingness to make mistakes is the problem. And I think that that's the moment we're in, is probably a lot of evangelicals are not in that first category of just rah rah. There certainly are some, but I think a lot of evangelicals find themselves pulled to this moderation. And I think Skinner and King would challenge us to do otherwise.
Mm. Sort of on that theme of moderation, what is helpful phrasing? Michelle asks, I wonder if defunding the police is the most helpful phrase. It doesn't emphasize the community reinvestment alternative. Maybe redirect police funding would be better. What are your thoughts about this movement and terminology?
Yeah. I mean, I think that my own take on it, just as a historian, is that we have invested tremendous resources and tax dollars into our law enforcement apparatus at every level in the over the course of the 20th century. At the same time, we have cut funding for lots of other stuff. You could say this also with national defense. Same kind of thing is happening. And what do you do when you have spent too much money on something? Whatever that is, that's what we should do. So you can call it defunding or you can call it something else, but we have, it seems to me, we are spending a lot of our money on things that are not working in reducing crime and that have unjust outcomes in terms of who gets locked up and preventing any sort of accountability for when bad stuff does happen. I mean, this is like one of the problems, I think, is that so often policing, ramped up law enforcement is a stopgap measure that does not address core inequities and problems that lead to crime. Mm-hmm. And so by any other metric, like, we should stop funding programs that don't succeed in that way. So so all I would argue for is the same skepticism and attention to law enforcement budgets that we have found it quite easy to do with reference to education, social services, you name it. So yeah, so I think there's room at the table for lots of different perspectives on what that looks like, and if there's a slogan if that slogan doesn't work for you, that's fine. But I think that that's probably what it looks like ultimately, is to take money away from something that's not working, that often creates inequity, and move it to something else.
Thank you. Will asks, is it normal, in your view as a historian, for 168 judges to be appointed on a federal and local level during one president's term?
That's a good question.
Do you know about this?
I mean, I think I see what he's getting at there. I mean, I don't know. That's not something I would have the expertise to speak to in this moment. I do think that it's evidence of that we should be paying attention to these kinds of things, and like who is making these judgments regarding our laws and everything. But I don't think politics is reducible to who's on a court or who's a judge. So yeah, that's a great question. I admit that I think I see where it's going, but I don't really feel like I have the expertise to answer it at this moment.
Okay. Maybe we can drop your email in. Well, I don't want to do that. My email is on the High Rock website, and you can feel free to direct any questions that you have about any of that, and I can get them to Aaron after this. I'm not trying to put your contact information out there. I'm sure people could find you if they need.
You
Google's
can find me on
amazing.
Twitter or wherever. Yeah.
Yeah. For the documentary, The 14th, emphasized how there are many businesses that profit off of the large prison population in the United States. Do you think that this is really holding back reforms, a prison industrial complex, if you will?
Yeah. I think there's a lot that the 13th film does really well. And I think the focus on private prisons is warranted in that it's an important, just like, it's on one level, it's just an important philosophical issue of like, do we as a society want to rely on private actors to do this kind of work that historically, I think for a long time we have said that that is not, that's the role of the government. I do think that that film perhaps overstates the way that privatization of prisons is a driver of mass incarceration. I don't really see it as much as, like, there's a lot of language in the film and elsewhere of how the incentive to like fill beds in prisons, in private prisons, to make money is like a driver of mass incarceration. I don't see that as a major concern, even as I'm also very concerned about that reality. So I worry that a strong focus on privatization of prisons by itself as a way to combat mass incarceration won't get us as far as we need to go. That being said, there is a lot of privatization that happens inside of public prisons. So if you go inside public prisons, you will find regularly, so not private prisons, just your state facility, how expensive it is to be a prisoner, and how costly it is to secure basic necessities and a phone call, and how wages are incredibly low. And I'll never forget, at a prison I was in a few years back, they paid really low wages for prison labor. But once you started to get paid for your job, then they started to charge you rent to live there. Like, you had to start paying for all these other expenses. And so it was just this bizarre, like, what incentive do people even have to do this work? And it's costing them to do this. And so I would actually say that's maybe where our focus should be, is the ways that we have turned prisons into money-making enterprises, and entire economies rely on charging incarcerated people for soap and for a phone call to their wife or son or what have you. So.
Thank you. This will just be the last question for tonight. And this person says that it's rhetorical, but they wonder how hopeful you are that our current government and society can realign towards a common goal, or will further polarization continue to further reduce any chance to collaborate and change?
I feel very hopeful for two reasons. One is that I believe that people can see what has happened and what is happening, and will continue to speak out, and will continue to advocate, and will hold officials accountable. And I'm optimistic. Like, I mean, because this is my story. Like, this was not something I knew a lot about. And then by learning and listening to others, I think it's something I've become much more interested in. And I've hopefully been able to transform not only my own mind, but engage in these kinds of efforts. And I think that transformation can happen in all of our consciousness. And there's lots of people to learn from. There are lots of wonderful activists, scholars, leaders out there who are doing amazing work. You should all go read Angela Davis, Are Prisons Obsolete? And it very well may change your mind, or it may not, but you should read it and learn from others.
Mm-hmm.
I also am hopeful because I believe in Jesus. And I believe that prisons are not forever, and that there are prisons are not institutions, are punitive politics are not things that will last, and they are not inevitable. That's not only an eschatological hope. That means that we can make a change. Like we made these things, so we can undo them. And that is the hope into which Jesus calls us. And it seems to me as a Christian that's part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus today.
Amen. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think even in the places that feel the hardest to maintain hope, that we can, be focused on Christ and what does it look like to be united with Christ in that work. That is the only hope that sometimes I can cling to, even on the days that feel the hardest. So thank you for that reminder and that witness. Friends, if you are looking to take action steps towards participatory work in undoing some of what we have created with the inequity in prisons and what it looks like to seek restoration for our incarcerated brothers and sisters, I would invite you to join the Rethinking Incarceration group that will be launching next Thursday. It's going to meet on Thursday nights for 8 weeks. And it'll be a learning community that's focused towards action, towards how we can work towards actually making a difference in the locations where we are. Wherever you are in the country, you are welcome to join us in that work. We hope to be mobilizing together. And then the other thing, if that doesn't feel like something that's accessible to you, would be to join our theology lab that is meeting 3 times this semester to dig into Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus by Reggie Williams. This is a group, this is a book that explores how Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a revered theologian and pastor in many circles, had been sort of ambivalent about his participation in the political process during World War II, prior to World War II in Germany, and came to spend some time in the United States doing his studies, and ended up in Harlem. Learned about nonviolent protest and about a vision of Jesus that was participatory and not just something that he could stay stuck in his head about. And so this group will be meeting to talk about the book, but we actually try to hold each other accountable to action in our own lives through our discussions. And we will have Reggie Williams joining us for one of those sessions. So no matter where you are located in the world, in the country, you are invited to join us in any of these groups. Because again, as High Rockers, we believe that we have to be curious and explore what it means to follow Jesus with compassion for others together. So we'd love to partner with you in that work. So there are links in the chat about joining any of those groups. They are Facebook-centric and meet via Zoom. If you have questions, my email is also in the chat, and I'd love to help connect you. And Aaron, thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your heart and also your knowledge. It's been a gift to the church and to whoever else was here, and to me personally. So thank you. Can I pray for you and for those that are with us to just close our time together?
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
God, we are called to be your hands and feet in this world as we partner with Jesus, as we are invited into relationship with Jesus. And sometimes that means stepping into places that will make us uncomfortable. Actually, Lord, I'm sure that it's going to make us uncomfortable. Being a disciple is not always easy work. So I thank you for Aaron, for your servant who has stepped into this space willingly tonight and share with us the ways that you have formed him uniquely, and it's been a blessing. So I just pray for his work in school as he is teaching in a time of COVID. I pray for his students and that you would just continue to work through him for your purposes. And for those that have joined us now and later, Lord, I pray that you would continue to get our attention about the ways that you are inviting us to respond to your work in the world. Amen. Friends, thank you for being with us tonight. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.